All right, hello juniors. Today we're going to talk about the background of a lot of the historical aspects about the Puritans, which are important in understanding the historical context of the play The Crucible, and also being able to really get the allegory that your author is making, comparing the time period of the 1690s when we're really going after and looking for witches without any evidence, and we're comparing it to the 1950s when we're doing the same thing, but not with witches, but with communists. We're calling people out as communists with no evidence, in the same way that we were calling out people as witches with no evidence from the previous time period. So that's an allegory, and we'll talk about it a lot. It's when you're telling one story on the surface, but the different characters, the different symbols, the different events that happen along the plot are direct symbols and ties to some other story that you're telling that's buried beneath the surface. So it's a complicated story, and that's what a lot of people like. They like digging for gold in the plot. Okay, so anyway, your first slide here is always something I like to start with. It gets kids' attention. Puritans were really into violence, in so much as they thought that they could physically eradicate evil and badness from anyone, but especially from kids. If you were a kid during the Puritan time, life might be a little bit hard for you, especially if you were somewhat naughty sometimes, or you liked to rebel, because that was not okay at the time. So if you were acting out, your parents might beat you or hit you with the understanding that they could get rid of whatever bad things were going on if they hit you hard enough. So, sorry, kids. Okay, so this slide here kind of illustrates and goes specifically on what I was just telling you. They literally thought that they could beat the hell out of their kids, which is a phrase that we use now, like, I'm gonna whatever the hell out of something. Yep, that's because people really thought that they could whatever the hell out of something, specifically beat the hell out of kids. Not like really, really hit them, but like get the badness out of them. Okay, so let's talk about Puritans. You've probably heard about them already from your history class. A great thing about this year's English class is it's going to line up really, really well with your American history class with Mr. Gluck. He will teach you something, and then in the next week to month, I would say, we are talking about one of the most definitive texts in our culture about that time period. So as you're talking about I don't know, some of the first immigrants coming over here and Puritans, we're going to be opening it up. We're gonna, as you're talking about, some of our country's first terrorists, the Puritans, we're going to be talking about a text that talks about them. After you talk about the 1920s, we'll talk about the Great Gatsby. After you talk about Native Americans and the ghost dance movements in the late 1800s, we're going to talk about that, Wounded Knee. After you talk about, let's see, the Great Depression, then we're going to read about it. So this class lines up really nicely. So hopefully you know some basic things about these Puritans. So let's go over the highlights. If you're in class, we would be having a wonderful conversation about it right now, but since you're watching this video, you are not. Here are some of the things we talked about. They were from England, which you probably know. They were some of our country's first immigrants, and they were really hardworking. They were also scared. And if you know anything about human behavior, about why, especially little kids, I've got a toddler right now, and it's so true. A lot of times, when you're scared, you'll act out in ways that aren't necessarily appropriate. And that is a lot of what these first immigrants did. They were really scared. The two main reasons that they were scared was because, number one, they, like a lot of people, and it kind of plays on our fear of the dark, but they thought that all around them was this, uncharted America that hadn't been explored. So they thought that the devil was literally out in their backyard in the forest. So it was really scary the sound. I mean, if you go camping and you're little, sometimes you hear the noises in the nighttime, or even if you're adult, I guess. But they thought that those were very dangerous things out there that they couldn't explain yet because they hadn't been out there. And out in the forest, they also, and the land beyond their little villages and towns that were starting to pop up were Native Americans who were not so excited about being colonized and being taken over by these strangers who were just saying like mine as far as the land and its resources were existing, and so they were not happy. And obviously if someone comes in and just like pops a tent up in your backyard and says mine, you may repay them with violence. We have laws now that are like, yeah, it's okay to shoot someone who's on your land, stand your ground. So there was a lot of violence that was potentially life-threatening for them as well. So they were scared. They left everything they knew, and they came to find a better world, just like immigrants now, and it was a dangerous life. It was a hard life. Here's a picture of, an artist's rendering of Puritan time, and I'm going to show you two pictures. There's this picture, and there's this picture. The first picture is a Puritan church, and what you can see is a pulpit up here. A lot of times they were even taller, and through the videos that we'll watch in class, you'll see some great examples of that. But you see your religious leader up high. You see everyone else heads bowed, little baby, kids happy. Their faces are in their books, dutifully reciting. It looks really solemn. And then if you look at this picture, this is not church. This is a courtroom, and it is specifically an artist's rendering of a witch trial. And you see a lot of similarities. You see a judge up high, obviously. I mean, judge, pastor, priest, obviously they're roles of authority. You see the opposite, though, of everyone here kind of, it's a little chaotic down here on the ground. Take a look at the two. They're both similar and different. And I just think it's a good visual to get to understanding how tied together their religion was with everything in their life, specifically their government, their civil government, which is what we really have strived to separate in the years following. And it's just always, I think, going to be a conflict for humans to separate religion from government and civil government, which can be hard for us at different times. Okay, and we'll talk about how it's connected coming up here. Okay, so they came to America. Now in classes when we would be talking about it, generally kids say things like religious freedom, which is true, but not maybe in the way that a lot of people think. So Puritans were people who were really hard workers, but they were frustrated with their current church. And so they were like, yeah, we're just going to go and start our own area in a new place. So if you think about why someone you may have known someone currently who has been frustrated with the church and switched church. The reasons could be the same or reasons could be different now in modern times. But specifically, the Puritans were thought of as extremists. They were, I don't want to say weirdos, but they were super more into their religion. They were zealots, you could say, than a lot of their fellow churchgoers. They specifically believed that the way that their church was going in England at the time was too much on humans, too much like human-centric, and not on specifically God's law that they saw in the Bible. They thought that too much power rested with the natural order of how the church had, progressed and evolved, where if you go to church, you see that there are probably like leaders and there's kind of a hierarchy. Different people have different jobs and are in charge of different things, but there's usually one person who's in charge ultimately. And then your church is probably a part of a bigger organization, and there's one person in charge there. And then the regional churches all go together into a nationwide organization, and there's, you know, a group of people in charge or one person. And so the Puritans didn't like that, and they thought that there's too much power in those people who are in charge, and it should really just go back to your connection with your religion, which is nice and simplistic. So they didn't like how things were run, so they decided to get out of there. So they came here. Massachusetts, as you know, is where a lot of our first immigrants were sailing toward. 1630 is a date that you could write down in your notes. That's when a lot of them started coming over here in bigger numbers. Not too long after the Pilgrims, who we always talk about in a few months from now. You know, you grew up in elementary school learning about the Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock, blah, blah, blah. So these are like the next wave of immigrants to come. Even though, I mean, they've been constantly coming, but this is another huge, famous group. Okay, so just like a lot of... you still see it now, where we use manifest destiny to justify a lot of our actions when it comes to taking land from people who already have land. Puritans also saw their lives as the same manifest destiny, where the New World, capital New, capital World, where they were going, North America, was a gift to them specifically from God. So their new villages and towns were theirs. It was okay for them to take them because they were a gift from God, because they were doing the right thing by leaving their church and kind of starting up their own area where they could practice as they wished. It makes me think of like hippie communes, which I've never been to one, but I've seen lots of movies and read articles and books about those, mainly in America, but I know they're all over the world, where a group of people decide like, hey, we don't like how it's going on here. Let's go start our own community, our own town, and do things how we want. So it's the same concept. But specifically, the Puritans used the Bible and passages from the Bible to justify taking what they wanted to from people who already had it, which is a common thing. We see it throughout history, and we'll probably continue to see it, but the Puritans did that too. Okay. Puritans, you can see your root in the word Puritans. You see pure. So pure is almost a synonym for simple. They really wanted to keep things simple, and I admire that from them a lot. I think simplicity in life is admirable. It always makes me think of the Amish. I think we're in a really unique area here to read about the Puritans, because we have this firsthand proximity to people who, in a way, are still living in that life. Amish are obviously different than Puritans, but there are a lot of similarities as far as rules that they live by. And of course, a lot of us who live up close and personal to the Amish realize that there are a lot of loopholes and ways that they get around their overarching rules for simplicity. But I think that's true of any culture, especially if they have really restrictive barriers going on. Anyway, so Puritans wanted to keep things this simple. They were looking for a simple way of life, a pure way of life, and this meant that they didn't have a lot of stuff. I think America, we're a big country of consumerism. We consume things. We like to collect stuff. Puritans would be the opposite. They didn't pride themselves on having a lot of, I don't know, toys, clothes, money, cars. They kept it small. They dressed really similarly. You'll see images both in pictures from the play that we're going to read and in the movie version that is wonderful, and just pictures in general from the internet. You'll see that they all dressed really similar. It's similar to Amish dressing. Colors are muted. Everything, there isn't a lot of like lace and frills and creativity that I think that we use to express ourselves with our fashion. Fashion wasn't a big deal. It was just a necessity. Keep yourself, covered. Keep yourself modest, protected from the elements of the weather. So not a lot of creativity in their life. Boop. They didn't have parties. They did celebrate things, but they didn't have parties in the way that we do now because life was viewed as keep it simple, work hard now, and then your party is your afterlife. So once you're dead, you can party, which is sad, I think, to me, but maybe it was not sad to Puritans. I don't know. Didn't listen to music. They did sing in their church services, which if you go to church, it's called meeting because you meet up, essentially. So that's a simple way of describing it. So they did have music then, but they sang it themselves. I don't think they used a lot of musical instruments. So if you have been to a church and you can picture how the music was, there was probably a gigantic organ or maybe a piano, maybe a guitar. Sometimes bigger churches have bands. In our modern religion, music is a big part of it. But at this time for the Puritans, since they were trying to live a pure life and a simple life, you strip out all the frills and you just get down to the nitty-gritty. And while they did have music, it wasn't fancy. Also, they didn't dance. This always makes me think of, right now, the movie Footloose, how dancing in that movie, the town's adults, didn't want their kids dancing because it leads to gambling and drinking and sex and all of the sinful, fun things of life. And I would say it's similar to the Puritans' reason for not dancing. In all of so years ago when I made this PowerPoint and was looking up different Puritan facts that I wanted to tell you, I never knew that this was a thing, but they also did not allow erotic poetry, which I think is ridiculous because when I think of poems and poetry, I definitely don't think of erotica or porn or anything like that. So I don't know if it was a weird, slant translation that's not made it down through if erotic poetry just meant love poems, or if it meant, I don't know what it meant, but I just thought it was funny. So no erotic poetry for those Puritans, which if you think about it seems, yep, that goes along with no dancing, I guess. So I don't know. But something I think that is rather shocking to us probably is that they didn't celebrate holidays, specifically Christmas and Easter, which are big holidays here, especially in the Midwest. Christmas is worldwide, I think. Even if you're secular, even if you're not religious, the holiday of the starting of the new year with Santa, that's big. But they don't celebrate that because if you're keeping it pure, it's really just about your relationship with your religion, with your God, and not about cake and presents and Easter eggs and the fun stuff. So save that, work hard during your life, and then when you die, when you go to heaven, then you can have all your parties. Also, the Puritans were not good farmers. They weren't necessarily from farming areas. A lot of them were from towns. But when they came here, their farming wasn't going so well. So if you think about what happens to us when we get hungry, sometimes I call it hangry, and a lot of other people do too, and they've got commercials about it. If you've seen the Snickers commercials, if you're hangry, you're not very good at anything that you need to do. So if you're not a good farmer and that's how you're getting your nourishment, you can't just go to the store because there are no stores really yet. You're just living off what you can provide for your family and your community. If you're not doing a good job, then nobody is getting good nutrition. And if you're malnourished, not only are you not going to be healthy physically, but you're not also going to be healthy mentally. As teachers, we talk about this a lot with our students. There are always new initiatives to have free breakfasts for elementary kids because hungry kids can't learn. Yes, hungry people can't whatever they need to do. So they were hungry. They weren't doing so well physically and mentally because of it. So even though some of their life specifics seem like kind of downers, here are some fun stuff about them. So even though Puritans weren't really big on frills and material possessions, they still looked, a lot of them are poor because they were starting over with nothing. If you think about what it would be like to just leave and go to a new country and have to start all over again. Not even with a language barrier, because you could still work in a community where everyone still spoke the same language. But if you left everything and started over, you would start over poor. You'd be starting at the bottom. So if they met people and knew people in their community who did have material success, they definitely thought of it as they were being blessed by God. So let's see. They valued the basic stuff, family life, community, really tight-knit, leaning on community members to help out. They did value art and literature, but I don't think in the way that we do in a modern culture here. They would drink some beer and probably wine, but not on like every day. So it's not like they came home from work and were like, let's get drunk, wife. That wasn't what you would see. And if you did, there were people, especially in your play, there are some people who are going to meet who are talked about as like alcoholics. Definitely a scourge on the community, which is, I guess, similar now. I don't know. All right. Okay, so that's it. They came over here. Life was hard, bad farmers, not a lot of stuff, keeping it simple, cool, just practicing their religion as they wanted to, the way they wanted to, not how they were told to kind of in England, so that's cool. And then came the witches. At this point in class, we're going to talk about what you remember from the witches. So here we go. So let's say in town, we're modern, and all of a sudden we start accusing each other of being a witch. We will talk about this, but there are modern accusations of witchery still in our world, but it's really not a thing that we see here in the Western world. It seems kind of silly, but think about why we would accuse each other of being a witch. If you ever hear about it now, it's almost as a joke. Like if someone does something like really lucky or amazing, sometimes people are like, whoa, sorcery, like, wow, that's amazing. You must have that's magic how you did that. It's almost a joke. Nope, not so with the Puritans, not so in the 1600s. These people were accusing each other of being witches because, first of all, that's what they had been privy to when they were in Europe. In Europe, witch trials and executions had been going on since the 14th century. So Europe, you may have seen some movies or heard of some movies. I can think of The Witch, and I can't think of there are other ones I've seen. They weren't particularly good, where women usually were accused of being witches for, I don't know, weird coincidences that happened around them, and then they were murdered. We had different tests that we made up, like, oh, witches shouldn't be able to, I don't know, survive fire. No, humans can't survive fire. Or witches should be able to breathe underwater. Nope, I don't know. Obviously, you can tell that I do not believe in witches as far as I know. So maybe someday I'll change my mind. But as of now, I am not a believer in witches. So if you are, when you read this story, that does make a difference in how you interpret it. But I don't. So that's how I interpret it. And your author didn't also. So we'll talk about that. So witch trials had been going on in Europe for hundreds of years. Over 50,000 had been murdered by people, usually men, and the people who were murdered were usually women or a person of color or a person who was just different than the dominant culture of an area. And if you think about it, whenever we are afraid of someone in our society, a lot of times it's because they're different than us. They have darker skin than us. They speak a different language than us. Maybe they have a different sexuality or religion or whatever. But if you think of the people who we are scared of or who are in the news, maybe not us personally, it's usually because they're different. And that, historically, is a catch-all of, she's a witch, or he's a witch, because he's different. So, number one, they accuse each other of being a witch because historically that's just what people did when they were when they saw someone different. Number two, these Puritans were fighting over each other's land. An easy way to get someone's stuff, if I want what you have, if I can get you locked up in jail, then I can get your stuff, potentially. If you are locked up in jail, then your land that you have, no one's going to be taking care of it. No one's going to be looking over it. Eventually, it's going to be up for auction, and I could be one of the people who buys it. So let's say you're my neighbor. I want to expand my farming operation, but I got to get rid of you. Oh, I know. I'll just say that I heard you were a witch in whatever way I want. Get you out of there, and then with a little bit of waiting, if I play my cards right, boom, I got your stuff. So whether or not they were there were all different reasons of accusing each other of being a witch. Some of them were, they really, really believed it. They thought that whoever was a witch for whatever reasons. And some of them were dishonest, which I think is really similar to a lot of the people that we think of as modern, moral and religious. Not everyone follows the teachings that they're supposed to follow. That's just how humans are. So Puritans were just like that too. And the third reason why they definitely accused themselves and their neighbors of being witches is because they were so afraid. They were afraid of everything around them, and a lot of times they were afraid of one another. So first of all, history. Second of all, jealousy or coveting. And third, fear. So those were the big reasons that they were accusing each other. And you'll see all of those in your text in the play that we were reading. And also, they were just upset. They were hangry. They were really cranky because they were malnourished. A lot of them. They lived a really hard life. So anytime someone is cranky or upset or sad or scared, all those negative emotions, they lash out in a lot of inappropriate ways. Nope, don't want to do that. Okay, get out of here. Boop. Okay, so conveniently, sorry. So conveniently, our Bible, the Bible has a passage in it, and it says this: "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So, which means you shall not allow a witch to live, meaning kill the witches. So if you are a religious person, you probably have a religious text, whatever religion you are. And if your text tells you to do something or has some, they're kind of vague. A lot of religious texts are also filled with specific things. But I don't really know how you can misinterpret this line. This line says, you shall not suffer a witch to live, meaning you shall not allow a witch to live, meaning kill the witches. If your Bible or your text says that, then you're probably going to use it to justify if you need to kill some people because they're witches. So in Salem, insanity is a good way to talk about it. We'll talk about what it was like there. There were 20 people executed. I think maybe 19 and a dog. I can't remember if it's 20 and plus 1 or 19 plus 1. But we tortured them. Not we, our ancestors tortured them. They imprisoned even more people who were eventually released. And they believed stories, the gossiped stories that their neighbors would tell of people flying, going out into the forest and having like witch meetings, witch sacraments means like ceremonies, maybe drinking blood, I don't know what witch ceremonies would be, doing scary stuff, and also signing in a book. The devil was known to have like a book. It makes me think of when I was little and I would have like my autograph book or a picture book, and so I'd like have people sign it, my friends sign it. In my mind, yeah, similar. Autograph book of the devil, which means if you sign it, then he has like your soul. And satanic baptism, the opposite of a baptism that you might know of. So there were all these stories of neighbors doing this stuff. And coming up, we will talk about the absurdity of when someone says, like, let's say someone started a rumor that they saw Mrs. Bloss signing the devil's book. if this were in like a couple hundred years ago, how could I prove that I didn't? I can't. So these witch accusations were just impossible to get out of. Once you were accused, you were in it. Um, it's almost impossible to prove that you're not something intrinsic on the inside. All right. So it created a mass hysteria. Hysterical is a word that we use to mean like so heightened frenzy that you just can't think straight. Um, and we'll talk about some other modern examples of mass hysteria. Some of them are just so bizarre, and this is bizarre too, but it's sad bizarre because, you know, so many lives were ruined from it. So not only did it create a hysteria, but it also created a crucible. The title of your text is called the Crucible, and you need to know these two definitions and how they can be applied to this play. Your author called it that on purpose, and he made them both evident there on purpose. There's a lot of smart hidden details in this play. So first of all, the definition of a crucible, number one, is a severe test or a trial, something really difficult that you have to get through. Test meaning like a book test, or a trial meaning like a court trial, or just like it could be like a bout with cancer or a really difficult time in your life, something that you have to get through that's really hard. So that's number one. The second definition of a crucible is a container that is used to heat metals really, really, really high, so then we can extract the impurities. So if you can picture like when you melt down jewelry, you can send jewelry into like places where they will buy it, and then they'll melt it down, and then they'll like skim off the good stuff and throw away the bad stuff. If you think figuratively, that's what happens that's what's attempted to be happening with the witch trials. So we're going to heat something. It's the container. So it's the big bowl, big metal bowl that we use to heat up metals so that we can like skim out the good stuff or skim out the bad parts and separate them and keep the good stuff. Okay. Mass hysteria, collective obsessive behavior. So not just you going crazy, but everyone. And it usually happens spontaneously, like it happens really, really quickly. And it's not just mentally where people are so riled up, it's also physically. We'll talk, I've got a video to show you of some historical examples to like really get into seeing how this isn't just like a one-time, like, oh wow, the witch trial is a one-time, you know, historical crazy story. Nope. This is human behavior. This is stuff that we do to our fellow humans continually. You still have cases of mass hysteria now. Okay. Boop, 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 yep, 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 yep. Yep. Sadly, you don't need to write this down in your notes, but there's a clear, like, predilection of females, girls, to go under mass hysteria. If you think of hypochondriacs, I think that's a good example where one person thinks they have something, like, physically wrong with them, and then, like, another person does, and then another person does. And then I remember doing an example, an experiment in a class once in high school where the teacher told us, hey, I opened up a can of something like really smelly and I put it in the back of the room, and I'm just really curious how quickly the particles will like spread through the air. Tell me when you can, anyone who smells it, tell me when you can smell it. And so at one point, and then he placed a mole in class, and so at like 10 minutes someone was supposed to be like, I smell it. So after 10 minutes, this one dude was like, oh, I smell it. I don't know if it was like vinegar or whatever. And then slowly but surely, other people were like, oh, I smell it. Oh, I smell it. Oh, I smell it. But joke's on all of us that he never did any of that. It was just like an experiment with our minds to see if we could make ourselves believe that since other people around us were doing it, that the reality was it was there. So that's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the trials. The trials were in the 1690s. So the first wave of Puritans from previously in your notes, and the earlier slide was in the 1630 something. So they've been here for like not a generation, but kind of a while. So the trials technically, they only cover a couple of months. I don't know what you think of when you think of the witch trials, but it really wasn't that long of a time period. The most important thing that you want to write down from this slide is that they used spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is ghost evidence. A specter, S-P-E-C-T-O-R, is not quite a ghost, but it's when when a person sends their spirit out to do bad things. So if you think of how like we all have souls, a lot of people believe in souls. So if you're a bad person, like a witch, then you can, your soul, like you have a ghost within yourself, like a soul or a spirit animal or whatever. And if you want to do bad things, but you don't want to get caught, you don't want to get caught. Maybe you're sitting in English class, but you're sending your ghost, your soul, your spirit animal, or whatever, to go out into the hallway to do mischief. So it's a bizarre concept where you can send your own specter out to do things. And it was like a catch-all that people would use, and they would say, I saw your spirit doing this, or I felt your spirit doing this, when even though you weren't there. Even though you have a solid alibi that you were at home last night, I think you did it, so I'm going to say your specter was out there doing it. How do you argue with that? Okay, so spectral evidence. You could call it ghost evidence. I'll call it that sometime in the class, but evidence that a person's spirit was doing something bad, not necessarily them. Also, there were trials in other colonies too, around the same time, but this is the most famous one. So just so you know, it wasn't just Salem. There were many other colonies at the same time that were going through this, but Salem is the most famous, probably because of all the deaths. Afterwards, this is nice. Everyone apologized after they kind of came to their senses. Restitution means like making amends. So restitution was made to the victims' families. They had a day, they fasted for a day, and they had a remembrance day. So once they realized, oh crap, we just did something horrible here to a lot of innocent people, they did try and make up for it. But I mean, damage had been done. Once you're dead, you can't really like undo that. So lots of innocent people were killed for no reason. Kind of tried to make up for it, but personally, if one of my children were murdered because my neighbor thought that they were a witch, I don't think a day of fasting or remembrance is going to make me feel any better, but okay. And here's something interesting. In 2001, the last people were exonerated. Exonerated means like you were freed from your charges. Sometimes it happens posthumously, like after you're dead. Hopefully it doesn't. But from what other we do this now. People are always they're accused of something, but they're innocent. 20 years down the line, we let them out of jail, and we're like, whoopsie, sorry so much, you're exonerated from the charge. You didn't do this. You're free. Sorry. So in 2001, we did this to the last of those witches. That's so much later. So it's so sad. Also, even later, in 2008, the last European witch was exonerated. So you saw from your previous slide way back there that there were over 50,000 witches in Europe that were murdered needlessly. And as I said earlier, like I definitely don't believe in witches. Sure, maybe some of them were actual witches, but I do not believe in them. And it would take some, I guess, first-hand experience for me to change my mind. But anyway, in 2008, even later, the last witch from Europe was exonerated. So as a modern society worldwide, we have come to our senses when it comes to witch accusations, but holy crap, did it take us a long time. Okay, so Puritans, I like to think of them as like, simple people who were also our country's first terrorists. But they also did great things too. The Puritans really believed in free education for kids, and they did it as a community because the community was kind of all, helping out everyone because life was hard. So they kind of gave us the mindset now that education needs to be free for, all kids. So yay. So thanks for our education, Puritans. They wrote a lot of sermons, a lot of the Puritan writing that we'll read. I've got a couple of examples from you. It's highly religious. It's The style of writing for religion at this time was called fire and brimstone, where there's a lot of fear and yelling and like dire consequences projected to keep people in line, fear mongering. So most of it is like that. There's a couple of love poems that I'll show you that are barf, but whatever, that's fine. They founded Harvard. That's really cool. Probably the most famous American college. So Puritans founded that. That's great. There were a couple of rebels, as there are in any group. Anne Hutchinson is a lady who we will talk about just a little bit. She was excommunicated, meaning she was kicked out of the Puritan lifestyle and church for just, we'll get to it later. So, yep. Sometimes people were executed if they were rebellious, so that's not good. Let's see, other characteristic. Yep, we talked about this being good because the next life is what it's all about. If you did happen to be wealthy, then it's yay because you worked hard, but really because God was blessing you. Hard work honors the Lord. Also, the devil is behind every bad thing, specifically. Not because you yourself are choosing to be bad, it's because you are overcome by the evil that is inside of you, so we better beat that out. By 1700, Puritanism was kind of going away. These are some of the reasons. We were just too busy with fighting our own wars. More people were coming out, coming over here who weren't Puritans, so just like the urbanization of the area, like population was growing. The Age of Reason is what we call the time period where a lot of people were questioning the religions of the time, and science was really growing. And the trials themselves really put a downer on the opinions of Puritanism. Yep. Okay, let's see, what do I want to say here from this? Yep, frugality, yep, self-discipline, yep. So hard workers and living with little was were the biggest qualities that they left around them, and education. Okay, so let's talk about the play really quickly. It's an allegory. So an allegory is a play, or is it any type of art. It could be a picture, it could be a political cartoon, it could be a song, it could be a movie. You've seen allegories for a long time, you may just not realize it, but it's a story with a sub-story. We're telling one story on top, and then we've got like another story that's buried beneath the surface that your author wants you to really work for. And if you don't get it, then, A, you're not smart enough, but B, you're not looking hard enough, and then you're not getting the full message from your author. So this is an allegory for the McCarthy era, and we'll talk about that around Act 3 when you've read enough of the play to really get into it. But the McCarthy era is when we were very afraid of communists. Oop, do I have more? No. Okay. So in the 1950s, we were particularly concerned with communists because of the Cold War going on with the USSR. It was led by a senator named Joseph McCarthy, and we'll take more notes on this later. But in the same way, sorry, that was a big stretch. I made my way through it, talked through it. That doesn't happen very often. In the 1600s, when our neighbors were accusing each other of being witches with no proof, because, you can't prove that, people in the 1950s were accusing their neighbors of being communists with no proof. And both of them, the communist accusations and the witch accusations, were driven by fear of people and people being different. This play right now is based on court documents. We used to read court documents from these trials from the 1600s. We don't really have time for that now. We've kind of moved on to other activities, but you could, if I have some, if you want to. And they're hard to read because it's hundreds of years ago, so English is a little bit clunky and different and a little bit foreign. But we have court, just like now, we've got the court stenographers who write down everything that happens. We have these from the witch trials, which is how we know a lot of the facts. However, this play is a fusion of facts with fiction. It's, if you imagine we had two decks of cards, or a deck of cards, and we got cards on each side. One side is facts, historical, and the other side is like juicier bits to make these stories better. And we shuffle the decks and we put them together. We're going to change some things. We're going to change some relationships, some like romantic relationships. We're going to change some ages and dates and kids and names. But for the most part, everything that happens in this play is connected to stories from the witch trials themselves. Okay. And if you are really interested in knowing some of these differences, I've got some information on that we can go over later. Okay, your author's name is Arthur Miller. He is a super famous author from American modern, well, he's not modern anymore, but modern drama. He was blacklisted in Hollywood, so he was an author who was accused of being a communist himself, which made him so angry, so he wrote this play. That's why he wrote it. And not just him, but a lot of his friends in Hollywood, a lot of his writers and actors and directors were also accused of being communists. So he was like, oh, hell no, and he got real mad, and he wrote this brilliant play about it. So even though it's about the witches, and it's great stories from the witch trials, it's really about what happened to him and his colleagues in the 1950s. Okay, so he was blacklisted, meaning if you're blacklisted, then I kind of put in a word with all my friends around the area, and you can't get a job anywhere. That's what blacklisting means. He was married to Marilyn Monroe, which has nothing to do with the story, but I just think it's really interesting, and everyone knows who Marilyn Monroe is, so it really like ties you into like what a big deal he was. Yeah, okay. So why are we going to read this play about witches? Because it's an allegory, it's also about more, but it really is about more about how we treat other human beings, how we look at things and people who are different than us, how we make up gossip and we don't care about checking the facts, all of the things that these people were doing in the play, except for like murder. But no, I guess we still torture humans. All of these things are still happening. Allegories are fun. They're like puzzles. It's like, digging in the sand and finding a buried treasure. I think it's specifically important to look at the horrible things we do as humans, just like the Holocaust, so that we don't do those types of horrible mistakes again, although I would argue that it's impossible. It's our human nature to be horrible to each other, and to just recognize how we do that and how we as humans can be so horrible. And also, buried within the horror that we see in this are just some wonderful examples of the best of humanity and integrity, which means like sticking to what you know is right, even when the world is against you. This play is wonderful for seeing how people can fight against the dark and be the light in the world. I think this is my last slide, but this is the gravestone of Bridget Bishop, who was the first first person in Salem who was accused of being a witch. And it's not on here, but she is quoted as saying, "I'm no witch, I'm innocent, I know nothing of it," to the death, to her execution, like many others. She didn't give in and say like, okay, fine, I'm a witch. She said, no, screw you guys, I'm not a witch. And the reason this is such a big deal is if people would give in and tell the trial leaders like, you're right, I am a witch, you got me, then you wouldn't be put to death. You'd just be in trouble. You'd be punished, but you wouldn't be killed. So towards the end of the witch trials, when people were seeing the reality of how they couldn't fight against this, a lot of them were lying and saying like, sure, I'm a witch, so that they could stay alive, which is exactly what I would do because I like life, and I would fight in whatever twisted way I had to. If you pointed a gun at me and you said, say you're a witch or I'm going to kill you, I'd be like, okay, dude, I'm a witch because I don't want to die. And a lot of people were doing that, but some people weren't. And we'll talk about the integrity of standing up for what you believe, even if you might die from it. And that's what she did. So, all right, that's it. I'm excited to start reading this with you guys. It is a fun text. We will read it out loud in class. So if you're gone, you'll have to make it up. But I've got audio for you. So hope you enjoyed that intro. Bye.